For generations of British households, a proper cheese board relies entirely on one specific foundation: the table water biscuit. When shoppers headed to the supermarket in early 2016 and found nothing but empty space where that familiar box usually sat, the absence of a simple cracker turned into a genuine, widespread annoyance. Customers were actively tracking down store managers, cornering them in the aisles, and demanding to know where exactly their Carr's table water biscuits had gone. This bizarre, accidental national crisis over a cracker revealed a hidden vulnerability in the modern food industry. We live in an era where global supply chains are supposed to be virtually invincible. If one factory goes offline, the general assumption is that another facility simply cranks up its user output to cover the difference. Yet this sudden shortage proved that every single one of those universally recognized pantry staples came from just one incredibly vulnerable place. Today, we're looking at how a basic water cracker built a Victorian empire, how a catastrophic weather event brought it to a sudden standstill, and how this heritage brand manages to survive the ruthless retail landscape of the 21st century. Back in 1831, Jonathan Dodgson Carr opened a small bakery in the northern city of Carlisle based on a highly radical concept. As a Quaker, he firmly believed in producing high-quality goods while treating his employees with dignity, a philosophy that was virtually unheard of during the brutal early years of the Industrial Revolution. But beneath that benevolent exterior operated a relentless business innovator. Carr intuitively grasped the financial dominance of vertical integration decades before it became a standard corporate buzzword. He wanted absolute control over every single step of his production pipeline. By 1836, he opened a large flour mill at the port of Silloth just west of Carlisle. He effectively transformed himself into a grain merchant, a ship owner, a flour miller, a baker, and a retailer all at once. Inside his bakery, he introduced state-of-the-art steam-powered equipment to mix the dough and mechanical presses to cut the biscuit shapes. This drive for ultimate efficiency allowed him to scale production to a level that smaller, local competitors simply couldn't match. Carr was also highly political when it came to protecting his bottom line. He aggressively campaigned against the Corn Laws, a series of protectionist trade barriers that placed steep tariffs on imported wheat to keep the price of British grain artificially high. This legislation made bread incredibly expensive for the working class, even during times of national famine. When the laws were finally repealed in 1846, Carr struck immediately. He began importing premium wheat directly from Canada at a fraction of the domestic cost, and this brilliant pivot allowed him to drastically increase his output while lowering prices across the board. It was in the middle of this rapid expansion that he introduced the table water biscuit. Carr had closely studied the traditional hardtack rations carried by sailors on long sea voyages. Those naval biscuits were practically indestructible but notoriously awful to eat, prompting him to entirely refine the concept. By mixing pure water with fine flour, he engineered a thin, crisp cracker that survived exceptionally well inside tightly sealed tins. The final product was delicate on the palate, but its incredible shelf life meant it could be loaded onto the newly built canal and railway networks and shipped across the entire country without spoiling. Once those sealed tins hit the market, the product became an absolute revelation. Serving as the perfect neutral vehicle for cheese, this simple water cracker catapulted the company straight into the commercial stratosphere. Within just 15 years of opening its doors, the Carlisle site evolved into the largest baking business in Britain. Carr rapidly expanded his floor staff to nearly 100 people, churning out a staggering 400 tons of biscuits every single year. The momentum only accelerated from there. By 1885, that single factory was mass-producing over 128 different biscuit varieties, backed by a dedicated army of 1,000 workers. This explosive financial growth funded community projects that cemented the factory as the absolute beating heart of the local economy. Carr provided communal baths for his workers using the excess hot water generated by his steam engine boilers, and he provided educational instruction, built a school, and opened a free library. He heavily supported the local hospital and funded a cooperative to build high-quality housing for his staff. He essentially built a microeconomy around his ovens, and that deep community integration is one of the reasons why the factory still exists today. The quaint, local history of Jonathan Carr and his benevolent Quaker philosophy makes for fantastic marketing copy, but the modern reality is far removed from that 19th century utopia. The independent family business was actually swallowed by Cavenham Foods in 1964, traded to United Biscuits in the 70s, and ultimately absorbed by its current owner, Pludis. Pludis is a global snacking titan formed by the Turkish multinational Yildiz Holding. If you map out the corporate family tree today, Carr sits right alongside mainstream everyday heavyweights like McVitie's and Jacobs. By wearing these different brand masks, the parent company can quietly capture every demographic at once. They use Carr's to lock down the premium dinner party crowd, while McVitie's grabs the everyday sweet tooth and Jacobs handles the casual savory snacker. The company effectively uses these distinct identities to cover the entire pricing spectrum. Whether a shopper is hunting for a cheap afternoon snack or a premium dinner party cracker, their money ultimately flows into the exact same corporate bank account. This strategy earns the brand, and by extension Pludis, billions in revenue. Yet no amount of corporate capital can override the stubborn physical reality of how a Carr's cracker is actually made. The entire business model hits a severe physical bottleneck because the Carlisle factory is operating with infrastructure that borders on the ancient. Even as Pludis upgrades its global supply chain with state-of-the-art robotics, the iconic table water biscuits are still baked in unique brick ovens that stretch for nearly 300 feet. These imposing structures are modeled on a specific design from the early 20th century, relying on a process that's remarkably slow and incredibly low-tech compared to the rest of the industry. Modern food manufacturing usually relies on high-speed convection and forced air to churn out products as fast as possible. The water biscuit, however, requires a specific type of radiant heat that only these brick tunnels can provide. The site engineers readily admit that this setup is a total anomaly in the world of modern steel and glass factories, as the bricks hold and release thermal energy in a way that's practically impossible to replicate at a high commercial scale. This creates a terrifying scenario for corporate executives. They can't simply flip a digital switch and ask sister plants in Liverpool or Stockport to pick up the slack, because the product fundamentally requires the unique thermal fingerprint of those exact Carlisle ovens to get the texture right. You might wonder why a billion-pound conglomerate doesn't simply build a backup oven in a safer location. Well, the reality of industrial engineering makes that incredibly difficult. The architectural knowledge to construct a 300-foot Victorian brick tunnel is ancient, and modern engineers would have to relearn concepts that have been rendered obsolete just for this project, not to mention the potential red tape with health and safety. But even if they managed to build an exact physical replica, they could never replicate the seasoning. Much like a vintage cast iron skillet, a century of absorbing heat and carbon has fundamentally changed how those specific bricks radiate energy into the dough. On top of that, imagine asking a modern board of directors to spend tens of millions of pounds on a deliberately obsolete, incredibly slow piece of infrastructure that bakes exactly one type of cracker. Yeah, you'd probably get laughed out of the room. It's a profound double-edged sword for the company. While this lack of flexibility guarantees a perfectly consistent cracker that tastes the same as it did 50 years ago, it also creates a glaring single point of failure. The entire global supply effectively vanishes the moment those ovens stop, leaving the empire balancing precariously on the continued operation of a few hundred feet of historic brickwork. This rigid reliance on a single physical location means that the brand's greatest strength is also its most terrifying logistical nightmare. And that's exactly why the events of late 2015 sent such a massive shockwave through the entire corporate structure. The sheer scale of Storm Desmond was entirely unprecedented. The nearby river Kalju burst its banks with such ferocity that it sent 5 feet of filthy, slit-laden water surging directly onto the factory floor, instantly threatening to erase over a century of industrial heritage. Inside the plant, the management team had to make a split-second operational call that would ultimately determine the survival of the entire brand. They executed an emergency shutdown sequence, killing the burners just moments before the water reached the ovens. This move was critical. If the cold floodwater had hit red-hot bricks while they were still at full temperature, the resulting thermal shock would have likely caused the structures to fracture and collapse entirely. But even with the ovens intact, the facility was a scene of absolute industrial carnage. The aftermath was a monumental cleanup operation where the company was forced to ride off and dispose of 10 tons of ruined chocolate contaminated by the rising river. Outside in the yards, an army of 400 employees, specialist contractors and suppliers spent weeks shoveling out 500 tons of sodden biscuits, ruined cardboard packaging, and thick river silt that had settled deep into every gear and conveyor belt. While the insurance claim eventually climbed toward an estimated £50 million, the marketing team knew that a payout couldn't fix the damage done by a vacant supermarket shelf. Every week, the product remained out of stock, created an opening for competitors to swoop in and permanently break the lifelong buying habits of their customers. Maintaining their hard-won retail presence was now a race against time. During this recovery period, the parent company made a daring branding move. Instead of hiding behind a sanitized corporate press release, they took out a full-page newspaper advertisement with a headline that simply read, "Flooding in Water Biscuit Factory." Oh, the irony. They were brutally honest with their customers, admitting that they'd searched the entire country and were completely unable to find another brick oven capable of delivering that same unique taste. By leaning into the absurdity of a water biscuit factory being destroyed by water, they managed to humanize a multinational conglomerate and turned a supply chain disaster into a story of resilience. But as the weeks turned into months without a single box of crackers on the shelves, consumers grew increasingly desperate. Reports from the time highlighted shoppers tracking down store managers and cornering them in the aisles, sometimes for 10 minutes at a time, just to demand an update on when the stock would return. This level of aggression proved that these crackers were a deeply ingrained part of the British diet that shoppers flatly refused to replace with a competitor. The factory finally fired the ovens back up in the spring of 2016, supported by a £1 million government grant aimed at protecting one of the city's largest employers. This restart was only the beginning. Corporate leadership realized that a simple cleanup would never be enough in an era of increasingly extreme weather. They launched a major project to fortify the entire site, which included a £5 million investment into specialized watertight flood defenses. The company had to accept that abandoning the location was a financial impossibility because the brand's true value was baked directly into those bricks. Their only viable path forward was to transform the oldest biscuit factory in the world into a modern industrial fortress. This deep reliance on a single geographic location has forced the corporate entity to remain intertwined with the local community in a way that's incredibly rare in modern manufacturing. Thousands of Carlisle residents have worked at the plant over the generations, forming a vital piece of the city's social fabric. The female workforce, in particular, became so legendary that they earned the affectionate nickname the Cracker Packers. Their cultural impact is so profound that a £70,000 bronze sculpture was commissioned and erected right next to the factory in 2018. Created by the artist Hazel Reeves, this monument depicts two women at work, serving as permanent tributes to the generations of employees who built the area's working class history. Their footprint extends far beyond the factory gates, with their life stories chronicled in the popular book The Biscuit Girls by Hunter Davies, which helped elevate their local legacy into national awareness. Factory management understands the immense value of this local identity and actively cultivates it to maintain a positive culture. This dynamic was perfectly captured when Margaret Carr, the great-granddaughter of the founder, celebrated her 100th birthday with a highly publicized tour of the facility. Having worked on the site herself during the Second World War, she was welcomed back to the historic boardroom for tea and crackers, surrounded by the oil paintings of her ancestors that still hang proudly on the walls. If you look at this situation purely through a ruthless financial lens, you might assume that a factory prone to catastrophic flooding would be slowly phased out. A standard corporate playbook dictates offshoring production to a cheaper, highly modernized facility in a safer geographic location. But Playtis is doing the exact opposite. They're doubling down and pouring vast amounts of money directly into the Carlisle site. In a recent move that signaled immense confidence in the UK manufacturing sector, the company announced a £68 million investment across its British operations. They strategically allocated these funds to upgrade facilities in Stockport, Liverpool, and Carlisle to ensure their infrastructure is entirely fit for the future. £2 million of that investment was routed straight to the Carlisle factory to expand the savoury assortment department. This vital cash injection funded the recruitment and training of nearly 50 new employees, all brought on board specifically to handle the constantly increasing global demand for the cracker lines. This expansion serves as a powerful statement of intent. In an economy where retail brands are constantly cutting costs and shrinking their workforce, Playtis is actively expanding its domestic footprint. By investing heavily in the local workforce, the company is signaling that the future of this historic brand remains firmly rooted in the same soil where it began nearly 2 centuries ago. The leadership at Playtis explicitly recognizes that modern business resilience requires a financial commitment to supply chain transparency and relentless operational upgrades. They're proving every single day that you can take a facility built in the era of steam power and successfully adapt it to the rigorous demands of the fast-moving consumer goods market. The story of the Carlisle biscuit factory is the ultimate proof that a business can survive almost anything if the core product is completely irreplaceable to the consumer. The company survived the repeal of the Corn Laws and the chaotic upheaval of the Industrial Revolution by constantly innovating its production methods. They survived extreme weather events that literally drowned their production line by relying heavily on the sheer grit of their local workforce. They lost a highly coveted royal warrant and simply changed their packaging without losing a single step in the hyper-competitive retail market. They've managed to perfectly retain the charm and prestige of a boutique Victorian bakery while quietly operating as a hyper-efficient, highly profitable asset for a global snacking empire. The executives sitting in boardrooms in London and Istanbul understand perfectly that the magic of this product is entirely tied to the bricks and mortar of that specific northern factory. They know they can't simply replicate the thermal mass of those ancient brick ovens, and they certainly can't fake the deep generational history of the Carlisle workers. But what do you think about all this? Does the knowledge that your favorite local heritage brand is actually owned and operated by a global corporation change how you feel about buying it? Or do you just care that the crackers still taste exactly the same as they did when you were growing up? Drop your thoughts in the comments section below. We'd love to hear your take on the illusion of local branding and corporate survival. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the fascinating world of industrial baking and retail strategy, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring that bell for more business documentaries. Cheers for watching, and stay curious.